Hello. All this month for Black History Month, I am profiling badass black women who made history and have been mostly forgotten. Intentionally, their histories have been buried. And I just want to emphasize that, the harm that is done is not just about when this history is buried, when it's deleted, when literally, in some cases, these records and archives are burnt and trashed. It's more than just losing these stories. It means that for generations, we haven't learned from our ancestors the way that we should have. These women were telling us truths 100, 200 years ago. And I just try to imagine what life would have been like if we'd been learning from them all along, the way that, generations have learned from like Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson. We would be living in a different world. But today we're going to talk about kind of a controversial figure, Phillis Wheatley. Phillis was born in Gambia in West Africa, somewhere around the mid 18th century, like 1753 maybe. She was kidnapped, actually sold by a local tribal chief there, and she was taken to America in 1761, still a young child. She was sold, in quotes, because I don't believe you can sell a person, sold to the Wheatley family in Boston. And they named her for the slave ship that brought her to our shores, the Phillis. She couldn't speak English at that point, not surprisingly, and so their daughter began teaching her how to read and write. By age 12, Phillis could read Greek, Latin. She was studying astronomy, mathematics, geography, and she began writing poetry at a very, very young age. She wrote a number of poems, but the one that really brought her initial acclaim was an elegiac poem on the death of the celebrated divine George Whitefield. He was the personal spiritual advisor for a countess in England, and that poem was published in 1770. And she said, "Thou didst in strains of eloquence refined inflame the soul and captivate the mind. Unhappy we the setting sun deplore, which once was splendid, but it shines no more. He leaves this earth for heaven's unmeasured height, and worlds unknown receive him from our sight. There Whitefield wings with rapid course his way, and sails to Zion through vast seas of day." Excuse me. So she wrote her first volume of poetry while still very young, and most people found it really hard to believe that an African American enslaved girl was writing high quality poetry. So she was actually forced to defend herself and prove that she was the author in 1772. She was examined and tested, quizzed by a group of white men, famous white men in Boston, including John Irving, several reverends, John Hancock, and the governor of Massachusetts and his lieutenant governor. Henry Louis Gates wrote an excellent book about Phillis Wheatley, and he writes this: "Picture the 18 men gathered in a semicircle. At the center was no doubt His Excellency Thomas Hutchinson, the governor of Massachusetts. Nearly all the men present were Harvard graduates, and a majority were slaveholders. The group that Wheatley faced was not exactly an association for the advancement of colored people. There was no transcript of what took place in that room. Was Wheatley given scansion tests, quizzed on the Latin subjunctive, asked to recite the Psalms? We'll never know. Whatever the nature of the exam, she passed it and earned the letter of support that she and her master had hoped for. They did conclude that she'd written the poems herself, and they actually signed a letter, an attestation that was included in the preface of her book to prove she'd written them. Still, no American publisher would touch it. They wanted nothing to do with it. So she traveled to London, and she got, remember that countess? She'd wrote the poem for the countess's spiritual advisor. That countess decided to help fund it. And so her first poetry collection was published, Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral. It was the first book written by an enslaved woman in the U.S., probably the first book at all published by a Black American. And when she got back to the United States, the Wheatleys emancipated her, mostly because they were being shamed by people who said, how could you still protest slavery and try to own someone? Later, she married a free black man. They had 3 children. None of them survived childhood. She was never able to get another book published. We know she at least wrote a second book of poetry, but she ended up working as a scullery maid in a boarding house. She contracted pneumonia and died in 1784 at the age of 31. She was hugely influential in terms of abolition of slavery. American abolitionists constantly pointed to her poems as evidence that Black people were intelligent, that they were just as capable of excellence as any white person was. Her name was famous and well known in the United States. However, a number of very famous white men decided that they needed to take her down. Thomas Jefferson, notably, in his notes on the state of Virginia, said, "Misery is often the parent of the most affecting touches in poetry. Among the Blacks is misery enough, God knows, but no poetry. Love is the peculiar estrum of the poet. Their love is ardent, but it kindles the senses only, not the imagination. Religion, indeed, has produced a Phillis Wheatley." He wrote it Wheatley, but it could not produce a poet. The compositions published under her name are below the dignity of criticism. MF her. So she wrote a number of poems. They are very much in an old style, old school, closer to like a John Donne, for example, to the Right Honorable William Earl of Dartmouth. That poem in part says, "I, young in life, by seeming cruel fate, was snatched from Afric's fancied happy seat. What pangs excruciating must molest, what sorrows labor in my parents' breast. Steeled was that soul and by no misery moved, that from a father seized his babe beloved. Such my case. And can one then but pray others may never feel tyrannic sway?" She wrote a letter to Samson Occam saying, another religious man, "In every human breast, God has implanted a principle which we call love of freedom. It is impatient of oppression and pants for deliverance, and by the leave of our modern Egyptians, I will assert that the same principle lives in us." She was the first of a long African-American literary tradition, which was mostly created by Black women. She's controversial because a number of her poems were not, people felt like Amiri Baraka thought they weren't revolutionary enough. That she wrote one poem in which she thanked God that she was brought from savagery in Africa. As a very, very young woman, I might add. And so they called her an Uncle Tom. I think that's very much unfair. But if for no other reason than Phillis Wheatley created a literary tradition and started a conversation about the intellect of African Americans that changed the world. I'll end with what Henry Louis Gates said about her. He said, "If Wheatley stood for anything, of course, it was the creed that culture did or could belong equally to everyone. That's an ideal that's been arraigned, interrogated, and prosecuted with unremitting zeal, but it remains worth defending." Phillis Wheatley, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for listening. Have a great day, and as always, please be kind.